Imagine you're a geneticist in the early 2000s, running what should be a routine analysis of human DNA. You're comparing the genetic diversity of men and women across populations, fully expecting them to match. After all, men and women have shared the same evolutionary journey for millions of years, right? But then, the data blindsides you. Women's genetic diversity looks exactly as it should. Stable, consistent, the result of thousands of years of growth. But men? Men's genetic diversity collapses, as if someone took an eraser to history and wiped out nearly every male lineage on Earth. Turns out, around 7,000 years ago, something happened. Something that crushed male genetic diversity across multiple continents. The bottleneck was so severe that today, every man alive shares genetic variation equal to just a few thousand ancient individuals. And here's the chilling part. This wasn't caused by disease or famine, or some asteroid slamming into Earth. This was something far more human, and far more disturbing. This was the moment human culture grew powerful enough to rewrite our DNA. Welcome to one of the most brutal chapters in history. When being born male meant your lineage probably wouldn't survive, and the few who did would forever shape the genetic future of our entire species. To understand just how bizarre this discovery was, we need to talk about genetic bottlenecks. See, in normal circumstances, when a population crashes, whether from disease, climate change, or disaster, you'd expect to see both male and female genetic diversity drop together. Think of it like a devastating plague that kills 90% of everyone. The survivors, both men and women, would carry forward only a fraction of the original genetic diversity. But the Neolithic bottleneck was different, completely different. Scientists discovered this by comparing two very specific types of DNA. First, mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through mothers. As they expected, this stayed remarkably diverse throughout this period in question. Women's lineages were thriving, branching, and spreading across continents just as you'd expect. Then they looked at Y-chromosomes, the genetic material passed down exclusively through fathers. And this is where things got weird. Surprisingly, starting around 7,000 years ago and lasting until about 5,000 years ago, Y-chromosomal diversity collapsed. We're not talking about a gentle decline, we're talking about a genetic catastrophe. In some regions, as much as 95% of male lineages simply vanished from the gene pool. Think about what this means. Imagine if 19 out of every 20 fathers in your community had no descendants who survived to reproduce. Their family names, their genetic heritage, their entire biological legacy gone. Forever. And this wasn't isolated to one region. This pattern shows up in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Across completely different continents, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, the same thing was happening. Male genetic diversity was collapsing, while female genetic diversity remained stable. So what could cause such a specific, gender-biased genetic bottleneck? Well, the answer lies in understanding what was happening to human societies during this exact same time period. To understand this genetic mystery, we need to travel back to the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 4,000 years ago. This was when humanity was undergoing the most dramatic transformation in our species' history, the agricultural revolution. For millions of years, humans had lived as hunter-gatherers in small, mobile bands of maybe 20 to 50 people. These groups were relatively egalitarian, meaning everyone contributed to survival. And while there were certainly leaders and followers, no one could accumulate massive amounts of power or resources. But agriculture changed everything. Suddenly, humans could produce food surpluses, they could support larger populations, they could stay in one place and accumulate property, and most importantly for our story, they could create permanent social hierarchies. For the first time in human history, some people could become vastly more powerful than others, and in most of these early agricultural societies, power became concentrated in the hands of men. We know this because archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of increasing violence and inequality. It was the period that we saw the rise of fortified settlements, specialized weapons, and elaborate burial sites that suggest extreme social stratification. The peaceful, egalitarian world of hunter-gatherers was giving way to something much more brutal and hierarchical. But here's where it gets really interesting and really dark. These early agricultural societies weren't just becoming more hierarchical, they were becoming specifically patriarchal. Property was passed down through the male line. Political power was held by men, and most crucially for our genetic story, successful men began taking multiple wives. This created a winner-takes-all reproductive system that had never existed before in human history. Instead of most men having roughly equal chances to reproduce, suddenly a smaller number of elite men could father dozens or even hundreds of children, while the majority of men had no children at all. Think about the maths here. If one powerful chief has roughly 50 sons with different wives, and 50 other men in the tribe have no children, the genetic contribution to the next generation becomes wildly skewed. The chief's Y-chromosome gets passed down 50 times, while those other 50 men's Y-chromosomes disappear forever. Now multiply this pattern across thousands of communities over thousands of years, and you start to understand how male genetic diversity could collapse so dramatically. So we know what happened. Male genetic diversity collapsed, while female diversity remained stable. But how exactly did this happen? Well, scientists have proposed several interconnected theories, and the truth probably involves all of them working together to create a perfect storm of genetic elimination. The first and most straightforward explanation is what researchers call reproductive skew. Essentially, as societies became more stratified, a small number of elite men gained access to multiple wives, while lower status men were shut out of reproduction entirely. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record in things like elite burials with multiple female companions, luxury goods that suggest extreme wealth and concentration, and settlement patterns that indicate sharp social divisions. Computer simulations show that even relatively modest levels of polygamy can create dramatic genetic bottlenecks over just a few generations. If the top 10% of men father 50% of the children, while the bottom 50% of men father no children at all, you get exactly the kind of Y-chromosome collapse we see in the genetic record. But polygyny alone might not explain the full scale of this bottleneck. That's where warfare comes in. The Neolithic period saw the rise of organized, large-scale violence between groups, and this violence was almost exclusively male. When one tribe conquered another, the winning males often killed or enslaved the losing males, while taking their women as wives or concubines. This created a double impact on the gene pool. Not only were losing males eliminated immediately, but their potential future descendants were also wiped out. Archaeological evidence supports this theory, as we're seeing increasing evidence of violent deaths, fortified settlements, and the development of specialized weapons designed for killing humans rather than hunting animals. Think about the genetic mathematics of ancient warfare. If a successful warrior culture conquers 10 neighboring tribes, killing all the men and taking all the women, they've just eliminated 10 different Y-chromosome lineages while massively expanding their own. Repeat this process across generations and you get a genetic landscape dominated by the descendants of the most successful warrior lineages. The third theory is perhaps the most sophisticated and the most disturbing. It suggests that human culture itself had evolved to the point where it could override biological natural selection. In hunter-gatherer societies, reproductive success was largely determined by individual traits like intelligence, physical fitness, and social skills. But in early agricultural societies, reproductive success became increasingly determined by social position, wealth, and political power. This created a feedback loop. Men who were good at accumulating power and resources had more children. Their sons inherited not just their genes, but their social position and cultural advantages. Over generations, entire lineages that were less successful at navigating these new social hierarchies were gradually eliminated from the gene pool. This wasn't just natural selection anymore. This was cultural selection, where human-created social systems were determining who got to reproduce and pass on their genes. Here's the crazy thing. The effects of this ancient bottleneck are still visible today, written into the DNA of every man on Earth. When geneticists map global Y-chromosome diversity, they don't see the branching, diverse tree you'd expect from millions of years of evolution. Instead, they see a genetic landscape dominated by a relatively small number of highly successful lineages. Take haplogroup R1b, found in about 60% of Western European men, or haplogroup O3, found in roughly 50% of East Asian men. These aren't ancient lineages that slowly spread over millions of years. These are the genetic signatures of specific male lineages that exploded in frequency during and after the Neolithic bottleneck. To put this into perspective, the genetic diversity among all men on Earth today is roughly equivalent to the diversity you'd expect from a founding population of just a few thousand individuals. Compare that to our closest relatives, chimpanzees, where male genetic diversity is much higher, despite their much smaller total population. We are literally living in the genetic shadow of ancient inequality. And this pattern didn't end with the Neolithic. Throughout recorded history, we see examples of individual men having enormous reproductive success. Genghis Khan and his male descendants, for example, may have fathered so many children that roughly 16 million men alive today carry his Y-chromosome. And similar patterns exist for other historical conquerors and rulers. But the Neolithic bottleneck was different because it was systematic and global. This wasn't just one or two successful individuals. This was an entire reorganization of human society that fundamentally altered our species' genetic structure. The cultural systems that created this bottleneck Patriarchal inheritance, male-dominated political structures, the association of status with reproductive success. These didn't disappear when the bottleneck ended. They evolved and persisted, shaping human societies right up to the present day. When we look at modern patterns of wealth concentration, political power, and reproductive success, we're seeing the cultural descendants of the same system that nearly eliminated male genetic diversity 7,000 years ago. The Neolithic Y-chromosome bottleneck forces us to completely rethink how human evolution works. For most of our species' history, our genes and our culture evolved together in a relatively balanced way, but starting around 7,000 years ago, human culture became so powerful that it could override millions of years of biological evolution in just a few thousand years. This is what scientists call gene-culture coevolution, and it's one of the most important concepts for understanding modern humans. Our genes shape our capacity for culture, but our culture also shapes which genes get passed on to future generations. The bottleneck shows us that once human societies reached a certain level of complexity, biological natural selection took a back seat to cultural selection. Success in reproduction became less about being the fittest individual and more about being the most successful at navigating human-created social hierarchies. And here's the really mind-bending part. This process is still happening. Modern male selection, reproductive patterns, and family formation are still heavily influenced by social status, wealth, and cultural success. We like to think we've moved beyond the brutal hierarchies of the Neolithic, but in many ways, we're still living in societies where cultural factors have enormous influence over who gets to reproduce and pass on their genes. The difference is that modern contraception and reproductive choice have given us much more control over these processes. Women, in particular, have gained unprecedented power to choose their own reproductive partners, which has helped imbalance some of the extreme male-biased selection that characterized the bottleneck period. But the fundamental tension remains. Human culture is still powerful enough to reshape our genetic future, and we're still grappling with the legacy of ancient systems that concentrated reproductive success in the hands of a small elite. Understanding this history becomes crucial as we move into an era of genetic engineering, assisted reproduction, and designer babies. The Neolithic bottlenecks shows us that humans have always used cultural tools to influence their genetic future. We're just getting much more sophisticated at it. The question is, will we use these new powers to create more genetic diversity and equality, or will we accidentally recreate the same patterns of concentration and bottlenecking that nearly eliminated male genetic diversity 7,000 years ago? From the outside, the Neolithic Y-chromosome bottleneck looks like ancient history, a genetic curiosity from thousands of years ago that has little relevance to modern life. But dig deeper, and you realize we're still living in the world that bottleneck created. The extreme concentration of genetic lineages, the cultural association between male success and reproductive advantage, the persistent patterns of inequality and hierarchy that shape modern societies. These aren't accidents of history. They're the direct descendants of the cultural systems that nearly eliminated male genetic diversity 7 millennia ago. But here's the hopeful part of this story. Understanding our genetic history gives us power over our genetic future. We now know that human culture can reshape our biology in dramatic ways, sometimes in just a few generations. We also know that these changes aren't inevitable or permanent. They're the product of specific social systems that we can choose to maintain or change. The same cultural evolution that created the bottleneck could potentially reverse it. More egalitarian societies, greater reproductive choice, and a conscious effort to maintain genetic diversity could help restore some of what was lost during those brutal millennia. We're living through another moment of rapid cultural evolution, one that could be just as transformative as the agricultural revolution. Genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, global communication, and changing social structures are all reshaping what it means to be human. The bottleneck may be over, but its legacy lives on in every Y chromosome on Earth. The question is, what will we do with that knowledge?